Okay, thank you, Pierre Vittorio, for the grand introduction and for the invitation. I will start. So my presentation is entitled The Basilica and the Rotunda, Type, Analogy, and Ritual in Medieval Architecture. So I'll start by saying that in the early Christian world, Jerusalem was not just a physical place on earth. It was actually quite hard to reach, but it was a heavenly city found in the hearts and minds of all those who opted into Christianity. So it was essentially an imaginary city, immaterial. Sorry, yes. I need to share my screen or something.
Stop sharing.
As I was saying, Jerusalem was not a real place. It was an imaginary city that was accessed anytime, actually, through prayer and through internal pilgrimage. And this divorce from the idea of physical territory and this kind of egalitarian universal character of the early church was very crucial. It was strategic, actually, because it allowed Christianity, that was illegal, monotheistic cult operating within the grand pagan Roman Empire, to spread all across Asia Minor and Europe, and to grow in these kind of pockets of autonomous communities that you see here. Of course, this changed when Constantine won the battle and saw the cross and decided to convert the entire empire to Christianity. And the following council in Nicaea, where it was decreed that Jerusalem, the real city in the east, should obtain this kind of superior status of a spiritual center. And so Jerusalem became, for the first time, a state project of the Roman Empire. And at the time, it was just a peripheral pagan colony without any kind of significant remnants from the time of Christ, which actually the city of Christ is the big dotted line that you see. So it was rather small. But when Constantine arrived with his mother, they found the places where biblical events took place, and they marked each of these places with a monument, a church, or a chapel, essentially inventing these sacred spaces. Spaces that were allegorical in the minds of Christians until then now really became tangible in this new sacred territory. And the way that it was ritualized is that public processions would move between these places in Jerusalem, where the life of Christ took place in this very site-specific ritual. Examples include on Christmas, they would go to the site where Christ was born. On Pentecost, a celebration took place in the Mountain of Olives, where he ascended to heaven. And on Easter, which is also now, so it's very apt, they visited the most theologically charged and spatially complex, which was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's this church, this kind of combination of the two types that you can already see here, was an enclosure of two separate buildings, which would really form, in my opinion, the archetype of Christian architecture. So let's take a short tour. In terms of history, theology, it was built not on one, but on two biblical sites. The hill of crucifixion of Christ, known as Golgotha or Calvary, and the stone tomb where Christ was buried and from which he was resurrected. Each of these sites was marked with a different space. So on the east side of the complex, closer to the street or to the Cardo, we see a wide basilica. And on the western end, separated by an atrium between them, was the freestanding Anastasis rotunda around the grave of Christ. Each of these types was born before 4th century Jerusalem, of course. The basilica was a civic Roman building used as a large hall for public gatherings, such as markets and courthouses. It was a utilitarian structure without a clear religious orientation, let's say. The only element which was somehow creating a hierarchy was the tribunal on both ends, where the judge or emperor would sit. So when Christianity was made legal and public, Constantine adopted the basilica as the house for the church, which was great because it was a familiar type for public gathering. It was flexible in form and easy to build. But the adjustment he made was to add this clear sense of orientation, stretching on an axis from the entrance to the apse, where the bishop was now sitting instead of the emperor. And the sense of axiality was reinforced by colonnades or arcades on both sides, which led the visitors both visually and physically from the entrance towards the apse or the altar. So this very horizontal space. In Jerusalem, Constantine wanted to build a monumental church to celebrate his own victory, and of course, the victory of Christianity over paganism. So he built this large hall with one nave and two aisles to host this kind of huge crowds of pilgrims that would come to Jerusalem to celebrate the public nature of Christianity. But this church wasn't a regular one in Rome where you could just have public services. It was also a site for mourning the death of Christ. And for this reason, there was also the Rotunda element to commemorate the death and resurrection of the most important figure in the history of Christianity. And this rotunda was modeled in typological terms after the pagan structures of mausoleum or the Christian martyrium, which were basic buildings that were basically monumental tombstones. In the case of paganism, for a deceased ruler, an emperor, and in Christianity, for martyrs who sacrificed their life for their religion. And unlike the Basilica, these were ritualized in a much more kind of centrally oriented service. So as you can see, there's a double shell, and the inner circle was where this kind of intimate events took place, and then the outer ring was used for circulation in and out. So in Jerusalem, it followed the same structure. You had the tomb of Christ in the middle. You had a ring of supports enclosing it. That was another ring of columns that kind of where people would move. And of course, this type was a merging of both the pagan mausoleum and the Christian martyrium, because Christ was both a deceased emperor who died as a god, let's say, but also a human who became the symbol of sacrifice. So this tension between the linear and the round reflects this dual character of the religion in a way. It's both the victory of Christianity and this God who died on the cross, but it's also mourning this kind of humble man, the miracle worker Christ that was buried on that spot. And these two spaces are really opposite in some sense. You have the linear, you have the round, you have one which is much more horizontal, and you come into a basilica and you look to the front, let's say. But when you're in a round rotunda space, you look up. It's much more vertical access, which also means that in a basilica, you enact these public group rituals, whereas in a rotunda, it's much more intimate, individual, silent, contemplative services. And it was really ritualized as one, as I'm now going to show you. So the diaries of a nun who traveled to Jerusalem in the 4th century reveal how these rituals took place. So when preaching to an audience, you see that the bishop was in the apse, and he was very conducting or even orchestrating the big crowds through the aisles and through this like hierarchy of the basilica. During Lent, when he had to interrogate those who wanted to be baptized into the church, they stood in a line from the front atrium, from the cardo, and all the way into the bishop that was waiting for them. But when he was teaching the Bible, it was a much more egalitarian setting where he moved in the center and they were sitting around him and they could speak about the Bible. When there was communion, there was a procession moving from the basilica to the courtyard, but only those that were baptized already could enter the round space, and those that were not officially members of the church yet had to wait outside, where they could hear the applause coming within. They could hear that there is some kind of a climax happening inside, but they could not see the moment in which Christ was resurrected, which is what the bishop was enacting inside. And I think, to me, what's interesting is that once you're inside the space, once you're in the church and you're inside this round building, then hierarchy was no longer existing. You're kind of all equal, at an equal distance and proximity with the tomb. So hierarchy was prominent in the basilica space, but no longer once you're inside. So to me, what is at stake here in the tension between the two spaces is the tension between hierarchy and universality, which is also embedded in the church itself, but is really embodied here spatially in the kind of tension between the linear and the round types. In the basilica, we see the aisles, the columns, the arcade, the platform, and in the rotunda, this egalitarian space when the only axis being the vertical one. And I understand this joint as type, and I want to read to you a quote from this book, which I will on type from Carlos Marti Aris. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. But he's saying that elements and the relationship between them are the ingredients that make up type. And this leads us to a new formulation of the definition of type, understood as a principle of organization by which a series of elements governed by specific relationships acquire a certain structure. So examining these rituals in Jerusalem show us that the juxtaposition of the linear and the round creates this condition where the bodies actually of the worshippers take part in this choreographed ritual that is deployed spatially to construct the Jerusalem archetype. So in my research for my PhD, I looked for places where this archetype, this Jerusalem type comes back again. And we see these examples from medieval Europe, from today's Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom. And all these structures that I've researched, they're not just randomly follow this type, but they each claim their own association to the city of Jerusalem and to the Holy Sepulchre. And as you can see, they're all different from each other. And in a second, you'll see just how much they're different from each other. But they all follow this deep structure, this essential architecture that remains constant. As Marti Aris says, architectural type is defined by the presence of a formal constant that appears in diverse examples and is situated at the level of the form's deep structure. So, for example, this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of Cambridge. Maybe some of you know it. It looks nothing like the church in Jerusalem, not in scale, the style, the urban enclosure, even the architectural elements are different. But the spatial composition at its core really follows this typological identity of the ones in Jerusalem and therefore is linked to it through this idea of type. So specifically, I will show you two 12th century examples from the Jerusalem archetypes that were built in Bologna and in London. And I chose these examples not because they're the most similar to Jerusalem. You'll actually see that they're quite different, but because they really construct this analogy to Jerusalem through rituals that spatialize this tension that I'm interested in. So the first one is the Church of Santo Stefano in Bologna. Maybe some of you know it as the Seven Churches of Bologna. And it was built in the 12th century after a moment of crisis in the city, when two devastating events, an earthquake and a fire, destroyed many of the city's monuments and left it actually without a cathedral and therefore without kind of a clear civic orientation. And during this time, a miraculous manuscript appeared, which chronicled the life of Saint Petronius. He was apparently the bishop of Bologna in the 5th century. And in this biography, found in the 12th century, but written in the 5th century, it said that he traveled to Jerusalem, he measured the tomb of Christ with his own hands, and then came back to Bologna to build a replica. With these own measurements, he took himself, and he was, of course, buried there and became the patron of the city of Bologna. Now, in reality, the tomb itself doesn't look like the one in Jerusalem, at least not on the superficial level, let's say. As you see the materials, the scale, the proportions. But since we're interested here in the typological level, we can start to find links here. So a short tour of the place shows you that around the Holy Sepulchre, this tomb, there is it's an octagonal structure, actually, not even around, covered by a dome. It's encircled by a ring of 12 supports, creating actually a very narrow space around the tomb. And this structure is accessed through several doors, just like in Jerusalem, from a courtyard with arcades on both long sides, creating this kind of linear rhythm. To the other side, where you have a shallow structure that terminates in 3 chapels, where various relics are enshrined, and the central one is actually cruciform in plan and contains an artificial mound, which is somehow supposed to emulate the Hill of Calvary where Christ was crucified. So this is a big complex. You also have the Church of Giovanni Battista, a crypt, and a Benedictine cloister and another chapel, but I will focus for our purpose on the central composition. So essentially, we see 2 sites. We have the tomb of Saint Petronius, the patron of the city of Bologna, in the grave that he built for himself, just like Christ in Jerusalem. And on the other side, we have this artificial hill where they built a cross, actually, to emulate where Christ was crucified. And of course, these two sites create the same tension, the same composition like in Jerusalem. In terms of rituals, on Good Friday, a replica of the cross was enclosed within the tomb of Saint Petronius, connecting his own death to the crucifixion of Christ. And men and women could come and kind of have this intimate moment with the cross. On Easter morning, the monks were carrying candles and moved in a procession from the cloister to the chapels and along the axis of the courtyard to the domed octagon. And finally, there was a service of the adoration of the cross, where it was built from the tomb to the hill, and worshippers can come and kiss the cross. So that is to say that in Bologna, the arcaded courtyard functioned as a roofless basilica, basically, with this linear rhythm and arcades on both sides, with this clear directionality that leads the faithful physically and visually towards the climax of the composition. In other words, we don't have a basilica or even a rotunda here, but it's still ritualized to create the same type. And here I want to have another quote from Marti Aris, who says that type refers to a formal structure. It is not concerned by the physiognomic aspects of architecture. A type emerges when we recognize structural similarities between certain architectural objects, regardless of their differences at the most obvious superficial level. So again, the fact that we don't have any of these archetypical types here, let's say, doesn't matter, because the relationship between them is what remains. So once we establish this as the Jerusalem type, we can understand that it really created a new Jerusalem in Bologna that changed the urban conditions entirely, basically branding Bologna as a proxy for the Holy City. And around a decade after it was completed, Bologna began this revival that lasted for a century and included the growth of the city from 23 to 100 hectares and the construction of those iconic towers we see today. Until today, Saint Petronius is represented as holding the city of Bologna in his hands. So he was kind of the retroactive invention of his pilgrimage to Jerusalem really revived the city in a way and boosted it completely. And actually, this idea of Jerusalem is very much communicated today, not so much through rituals, but through these A4 papers that are printed when you visit the church. So they remind you that it's still there. Or it's somehow commodified because they sell you holy water that brought from Jerusalem just next to this tomb in the center. So the second case study I will show you briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, is the Temple Church in London, which was also built in the 12th century, but this time by the Templars, which were a very vicious monastic order of kind of monks, knights who lived by force and by faith, established during the First Crusade. So the Crusades were a series of religious wars waged at the end of the 11th century by the Catholic Church to recover control of Jerusalem. When they arrived in the city, it has been under Islamic rule for about 400 years. So the religious focal point of the city was no longer the Christian sites, but the Temple Mount, also known as the Haram el-Sharif. And on Temple Mount, there are two Islamic shrines until today that were built in the 7th century, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a 7-aisled basilica, and the Dome of the Rock, which is an octagonal structure, which you probably know, crowned by this famous, iconic golden dome. And inside you have the rock, the exposed bedrock, where Muhammad is believed to have risen to heaven. So when the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, their focus was on not only reclaiming destroyed grounds of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but also to appropriate, actually, the Islamic shrines from Islam to Christianity. In this quite violent process, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was renamed the Temple of Solomon and was turned into an armory. And the octagonal Dome of the Rock was called the Temple of the Lord, where they built a chapel for St. James and for Mary. And this repetitive use of the word temple was meant to draw a connection to the Jewish temple, which was built on the same site. It's part of their project to basically eliminate Islam and create a direct connection to the Jewish monarchic dynasty of King David and King Solomon. So on Temple Mount, is where the Order of the Templars were established, and their official job was to protect pilgrims on the way to the Holy Land and to safeguard the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They actually had the keys to the church, and you see here from their seal that it's actually the Islamic Dome of the Rock on their seal. And because they had the keys, because they had such this big role, they were extremely powerful in Jerusalem, but also across Europe. And essentially, they were bankers. They would loan money to kings. They would give manpower to the crusaders, and they realized that they need to store this capital in a site that would really signify their wealth and their possession of Jerusalem. So they arrived in London. They were given a site by King Henry II on the banks of the Thames, close to Holborn, and they built their precinct there as this kind of walled enclave with gardens, orchard, a cloister, and lodging for their knights, priests, and servants. And maybe you can already see our church in the middle. It was the focal point of the order. It was a place for mass. It was their treasury and a source of their revenue from pilgrims. And as you can see, it had two distinct spaces. One is called the round, which had this ring of 6 marble columns. And the choir that extended from it is more of like a hall church, with a central nave and 2 aisles. And the altar was on the eastern edge, actually. So in terms of rituals, the round was once again kind of atop of the spatial hierarchy. And every Sunday, Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, there was a chapter meeting of the knights, where they would gather, but sit across the walls, actually not in the inner ring, but on the outer ring, creating a kind of equality between all of them as they discuss their weekly concerns. The initiation ceremonies, which were quite infamous for whatever they were doing, the novices were surrounded by their family and friends in the choir, but then moved in a procession into the round where only the novices were allowed to enter with the knights. And it's inside they were doing whatever they were doing, but also taking vows of poverty between God and the other brothers. So once again, we see this dynamic relationship between the two spaces, which allowed the rituals to be mobile and hierarchical at the same time. But what's interesting to me about this church and the spatial setting, that the strong characteristics of each type was actually negated by the architecture. On the left, we see that the round did not even have a central element that would create kind of a centrifugal composition. And this makes sense because they were all sitting with their backs to the walls. They did not commemorate a single person, but actually there were a series of knights buried beneath the floor. And on the right, we see that the choir had these high windows, this flat ceiling, and very thin columns that creating more of a field condition of diffused light without any clear linear hierarchy. So I think that the theological component in both spaces was also somehow negated in favor of this more kind of, for a lack of a better word, secular or institutional power. And this continuity of spaces can also be seen in the marble columns that go from the choir into the round. So it's more of a fusion of the two elements, I would say. It's almost a harmony, which relieves this archetypical tension. And this condition is further exacerbated by the location of the entrance, which is actually not from the short side, but from the long side, the south, which doesn't construct this axial movement. Actually, when you come in, you're quite disoriented by where the service is, where the focal point is, let's say. And this ambivalence was made clear when the Eucharist was performed at the altar and the congregation had to turn their back into the round. And for me, this reversal of orientation and the diffusion of this field condition and this bipolar composition between the two sides is a typological variation on Jerusalem, but not on Christian Jerusalem, but actually on the Islamic Temple Mount. Because if you look at this, the Qibla in the Al-Aqsa Mosque was actually orienting Muslims towards Mecca, but away from the Dome of the Rock. And if you see it once more on the Temple Mount, they're indeed two separate structures, but are legible nonetheless as one sacred enclosure. And I find this incredibly interesting that despite, they're wanting to bring Jewish temple to Jerusalem and to bypass Islamic history, they actually replicated the Islamic adaptation of the Christian type. And here we see it being ritualized and really appropriating the Muslim Temple Mount into Christianity meant that the religious setting was transported into the West, where the tension between the linear and the round was kind of softened by this diffused field condition of the mosque and the dual prayer orientation in the Haram al-Sharif. And I think to me, this teaches us something about typological understanding. The type, and this is again from this book, the type is found in the very root of architecture and its constituent elements. This is why it always remains, always comes back under different manifestations. And the identity of architecture comes down to a formal constant perceived through endless example, each materializing in a different way. And in the case of the Templars, as you can see here, the church is basically just a fusion of these two elements and the not so monumental door on the south side. The evolution of the Christian type and its interaction with Islam was for me no longer about theology, but about commodity in a way. And their desire to give form to their possession of Jerusalem created this icon, this archetype that appropriated Jerusalem more for its political rather than its spiritual charisma. So to conclude, the two cases I showed you today from Bologna and London portray how this tension between the round and the linear were translated into 12th century Europe, where it played a crucial role in the shaping of the city, whether it's Bologna or London. And while none of these examples exhibit the typical Basilica and Rotunda combination, we can still understand their structure through the typological base that lies at their deep structure. This is the last quote. History and typology emerge as two complementary aspects. While history illuminates processes of change, typological analysis reveals what stays the same during this process. And each of these aspects requires the other, as only change can shed light on what persists. And it's true, both of them are entirely different, but they nevertheless are united by this type. And I will end with this plan of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre drawn by a 7th century pilgrim before the invention of print media, when builders in the Middle Ages relied on rituals to conceive architecture that would host them. They worked in teams and utilized their memory, imagination, and analogical thinking to lay out complex structures according to liturgical functions, rather than surface-level signifiers. And today, architectural thinking is primarily visual. It creates superficial connections that lack the ability to create typological links to that which is constant and consistent. And I argue that recovering a typological understanding can therefore inform not only how we read structures, but also how we teach and conceive architecture through memory, imagination, and analogy. Thank you. It was a bit long. I'm sorry.
Well, I think we have maybe some time for one or two questions. We will actually have some time for questions. Sorry, we will have some time for questions after each presentation, but then we'll also have a plenary discussion at the end of each session. But maybe one or two questions for Gili. But maybe I can start with one question, and perhaps I would like you to elaborate more on the difference between type and archetype, because actually you could also argue that the Rotunda and the Basilica can also be understood as archetype. I mean, they have a very powerful image. And why you stick actually, of course, because the symposium, but I think why you stick actually on the idea of type rather than really using them as archetypes.
I think that in my case, in my analysis, the Basilica and Rotunda are two types indeed, but then their combination creates this archetype. And I think type is really, at least in this case, their type is more about interior space. It's more about maybe two opposite forms of interior space. As I showed, one is very linear and horizontal, and one is primarily vertical. But I think once it becomes an archetype, it becomes almost like an icon, like an image. And this is when it's also a bit vulnerable to commodification or to destruction somehow, because I think the type is still can be anonymous, can be subdued, can be diffused, can be consumed by a structure, as we've seen in Bologna, for example. But in London, I think the archetype really becomes this icon, which is then exploited for political power as opposed to for its use value.
So you could say that in a way, archetype stress more the image
I think so.
result, and therefore is something that can be consumed much more superficially in a way, no? Where type really requires a much more imaginative work, to
absolutely. Yeah, maybe Davide would not agree with me on this on the but yeah, I would say that the archetype is the more vulnerable.
Yeah,
let's say. Yeah.